Hi class, today we're going to start the new unit and we're going to start it with Hobbes. Um, this reading has a lot going on, but I think Hobbes actually distributes it in kind of a helpful way. Um, and so let's talk very briefly about what he's doing and how we can use it. So we're reading out of the Leviathan, which Hobbes wrote in 1651. Hobbes was a British philosopher. He hung on and was very sharp for a long time. He lived from 1588 to 1679. So he really hung on there, and he seemed to be lucid the whole time. He had some problems writing at the end due to arthritis type stuff, but he was advisors to to princes, and um, his views on politics were very important and sometimes controversial if you realize what was going on during the time period in which he lived with the Glorious Revolution and what have you. Anyway, that's all background. Not going to come up on the exam, but that's what we're talking about. And so what we're talking about is the role of government. And you say, wait a minute, why is that in the human nature unit? Excellent question. But reminder, I briefly hinted at this in the last video. What both Hobbes and Rousseau are doing is this thought experiment where we imagine what life is like in the state of nature. By state of nature, we mean pre-government, pre-society, humans as animals kind of view, and talk about how that situation is and how humans are in that position. So that's where human nature comes into play. And then we put those together and say, well, what is it about humans and their nature that makes them cluster together into a civil state, into a government? And if we could answer that, well, what is it about human nature that leads us into governmental structures? That'll actually tell us something very important, because that will tell us what needs the government actually should be fulfilling. And so that's kind of the connection. So uh, that's what's going on. And so we're now going to talk about how the Hobbes reading goes. You get 3 chapters, chapters 13, 14, and 15. In 13, he's just going to describe the state of nature and how it is. And of course, if you've done the reading, which you should have done before watching the video, you'll realize it's not particularly good. But then, before he moves on, he's going to go into chapter 14 and kind of work backwards and fill in all the philosophical apparatus. So we move from just kind of a depiction to employing important philosophical terms like rights and liberties and what have you. And then in chapter 15 is basically how we move from a government to a civil state. One extra thing worth noting, I already mentioned we're reading from the Leviathan. Leviathan is a reference to a biblical creature. Leviathan and Behemoth were mentioned in Genesis, I think. But the Leviathan was basically the biggest. And that's, in an important sense, what Hobbes thinks the government should be. The government needs to be the biggest and the strongest for reasons we'll get into. And so when he says Leviathan, think government. And so that's where the title comes from. So that's what we're going to do. So start with the state of nature. Is the state of nature someplace you would want to live in, according to Hobbes? And the answer is, of course, no. Skipping ahead to the summary, he has the famous line where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That is life in the state of nature. Why? Take it in a couple of steps. First and foremost, this is kind of funny, humans in the state of nature are equal. We have equality in the state of nature. And you might say, wow, great, except we're going to say, whoa, terrible, because the relevant sense of equality is that we are all equally a threat to one another. In the state of nature, says Hobbes, the weakest can kill the strongest. Why? Because the strongest has to sleep at some point. And so, in the state of nature, first and foremost, because our differences are negligible, we are all equal in the sense that each human is equally a threat to one another. in and of itself, that wouldn't be a huge problem, except not only are we a threat to one another, but we have reason to be violent towards one another. And Hobbes gives 3 reasons why humans might be antagonistic and violent towards each other: competition, diffidence, and glory. Um, so, competition for gain. Well, if you want the food and I want the food, we're going to have to settle it, and it's going to be settled violently. Interestingly enough, the diffidence one, Hobbes says, for safety. So here's a weird thing again in the state of nature. Well, if I'm about to go to sleep with my apple pile and I see you lurking about, I might do a preemptive strike, so to speak. And that's what he means by coming into conflict due to diffidence. That, well, in order to keep myself safe means actually to harm you. And the last one for glory, what Hobbes says is that means for reputation. Well, suppose you tried to steal my apples and I caught you. Well, I might make an example of you, so to speak, so that others don't try to steal my apples. And so put these 2 things together and we have bad trouble. So the 2 things being, 1, everyone is equally a threat to one another, but 2, everyone has a motive to be in conflict or causes of quarrel. Put those 2 together and you have a very unpleasant state of nature. Everyone can kill each other. Everyone has motive to kill each other. As such, in this hypothetical state of nature, Hobbes says it would be a war of all against all. So, for those 2 reasons put together. And I do mention that it's a hypothetical because Hobbes isn't convinced there ever was a state of nature. That's not the purpose of the exercise. But in this war of all against all, what don't we have? Importantly, we're not going to have industry. No industry at all. We're not going to have farming or the arts or anything like that. Why? Well, because we have no certainty of the future. I'm not going to plant crops if I don't know whether I'm going to be around to harvest them later, or if someone will have chased me off or stolen them. And we mean like any industry. Suppose I find like a really nice apple picking stick. Well, what's that going to do? It's going to get me killed. I'm gonna go to bed and somebody's going to take my apple stick with extreme prejudice. And that goes for if I, say, find a nice little cave to sleep in or whatever, too. That just paints a target on me. So there is no industry at all. And, of course, that leads to a very unpleasant state. That's why he says their life is so poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But here's something interesting. Because we're in the state of nature, and you might say, if some of the reasons for quarrel that we were talking about sound a little brutal to you, like killing someone for your own safety because you want to go to bed peacefully, remember, this is the state of nature. And for Hobbes, he says pre-societal humans, there's not really any such thing as right and wrong, or no sin, as he calls it. There's also no justice or injustice. Those are things that just do not apply in the state of nature. And he's not alone in thinking that in terms of philosophers, but he's quite explicit about this. So we don't have any of those things, so we're just doing what we need to survive, and we're coming into quarrel, and it's misery. And so says Hobbes that fear inclines us to peace. Why? Because I want to be able to go to bed and still have my apples in the morning and still have my jugular intact in the morning, right? That's what I want. And as long as I fear all other humans, that's not going to happen. And so, looking forward a little bit, what are we going to have to do is, well, we're going to have to somehow get together and make agreements such that we can survive. And so, but we have to be really careful how we do this. Well, suppose you and I work together and get a nice apple pile, and I say, well, I'll watch the apples while you're sleeping, you watch the apples while I'm sleeping, and we'll feast in the morning. And you say, great! And you go to bed, and I slit your throat and take all the apples. Fine in the state of nature, because there's no such thing as justice or injustice. And so what we need is some way to keep those agreements in place. That's ultimately what we're looking for, and ultimately what Hobbes is going to tie to the state of nature. So let's pause there. So that's pretty much the end of chapter 13. And then I really like the way Hobbes does this. Then he's going to go back, kind of backtrack in chapter 14 and build the philosophical apparatus into it. There's a whole lot of definitions. I will specifically emphasize the definitions for which you are responsible. And you can kind of let the rest go by the wayside. Also, you'll probably notice the definitions might sound a little funny or a little vague. That's not laziness on Hobbes' part. Instead, Hobbes is giving general definitions. That is, he's giving definitions that apply both in the state of nature and in a civil state. And so you need to talk with a sufficient generality so that, for instance, his definition of right and law can cover both of those equally and accurately. So he starts with a definition in chapter 14. The reason that none of this stuff is sin or unjust is because we have what's called the right of nature. So that's required thing number one. The right of nature is basically that we're allowed to use whatever power we have to preserve ourselves. And if that includes killing you before I go to bed, so be it. I have that right. So that's called the right of nature. Animals have a right to survive. Oh, by the way, I should pause here. Notice what humans are in the state of nature. If you need like a bumper sticker way to think of it, for Hobbes, what's human nature? Humans just seem to be basically the equivalent of really clever wolves. Because of the right of nature, we are entirely self-interested, and we are entirely without a moral compass in the state of nature. And so, yeah, human nature for Hobbes is we are completely self-interested. And that's important to realize. The reason we go into government, for instance, into a civil state, is self-interest. That's it. And so, again, think of human, for the Hobbesian notion of human nature, is roughly speaking, clever wolves. We're always exercising the right of nature and doing what we need to survive. The next two definitions you should know are liberty and right. I'm not quite doing this in the order Hobbes does it. Those might sound very similar. So a liberty is just a lack of impediments. So a liberty might be, in essence, something like a freedom. Just a lack of external impediments. The only thing stopping me is my own will. So, for instance, I have the liberty to raise my arm right now, no problem. I don't have the liberty to levitate right now. There's an external impediment on that. But also, I have the liberty to kill you, to protect my apples, etc. By contrast, a right, says Hobbes, is the liberty to do or forbear. And those sound incredibly similar. So a liberty is a lack of external impediments. A right is the liberty to do or forbear. What's the difference? As we're going to see, a right can be surrendered. A right can be given up. A right can be transferred. And that's exactly what we're going to have to do to get out of the state of nature, by the way. And so that's liberties and rights. Then we're going to talk about a law and the law of nature. And so a law generally is anything that determines or binds. That includes things like laws of physics and laws of mathematics, but also laws of reasoning for Hobbes. Whereas a law of nature is a little more specific than that. Law of nature has a two-part definition. And again, if it sounds a little weird, it's because it must apply in the state of nature and in society. But a law of nature, part one, is discovered by reason. That's the first half of the definition. And it is used to preserve ourselves or our lives. So discovered by reason, used to preserve ourselves. So notice, uh, this is a pretty clever definition because it actually covers the things we think of as laws of nature now. So is it, for instance, does this cover the law of gravity? Well, is the law of gravity discoverable by reason? Yep, Newton did so. And can I use that law to help preserve my life? Yes, I am not going to jump off of something 30 or 40 feet tall. And so the things we normally think of as laws of nature are covered under this definition. But, says Hobbes, there's also these laws of reasoning that we're going to figure out that would help preserve ourselves, specifically to help get us the heck out of the state of nature. And so these, Hobbes gives us the first 3 laws of nature. You will be responsible for those on the exam. But we'll get there in a minute. So, we know what a liberty is, we know what a right is, we know what a law and a law of nature is, and the right of nature. First of all, let's recast a little bit of what we said in part 1 in terms of rights. In the state of nature, literally pause the video and think about this for a second. What rights do people have? Here's the funny thing. With rights in the state of nature, we all have a right to everything. Everyone has a right to everything. And that's the problem. Because I have a right to my apples, but you have a right to my apples. And, not to get too graphic, but same goes for our bodies. Well, I have a right to my body, but you have a right to my body, etc., etc. That's how there's no wrong and no sin in the state of nature, because we have rights to these things, because a right is simply the liberty to do or forbear. And if I haven't surrendered my rights, then I have a right to your apples. And that is a problem, because that's what leads us to no security. I want my apples. I want to be able to sleep and have my apples and my jugular in the morning. So what do we need to do? The problem is we have too many rights. Pretty simply, I want to have a right to my coffee, but I don't want you to have a right to my coffee. That's what I want. That's not what I have in the state of nature, but that's what I want. And so what might we do? Well, I'm going to keep my right to my coffee, but I want you to surrender the right to my coffee. And why might you do that? Because in exchange, I will surrender my right to your coffee. And so to get out of the state of nature, we basically need to lay down or surrender the vast majority of our rights in order to pursue peace. So the problem in the state of nature, too many rights. Fortunately, we have a government to take most of them away. I know, it sounds weird. But so we have the first laws of nature. So we need to pursue peace. That's actually the first law of nature for Hobbes. Remember, laws of nature are discoverable by reason and used to preserve ourselves. And I need to pursue peace is exactly that. Reason tells me that the state of nature is untenable. I can't live my life in a war of all against all with no industry. So reason tells me I need to get out of the state of nature, and doing so will help preserve myself, because we'll get rid of all these conflicts. So first law of nature is to pursue peace. The second one, what we already talked about, what do we need to do in order to pursue peace? We need to lay down our rights. Not all of our rights. Hobbes is quite clear. You can't give away all your rights. But we need to give up a lot of our rights. You need to surrender your right to my stuff. And I need to surrender my right to your stuff. And that, basically, as they say, is that. Except, here's the tricky part. Remember the original example. Not original, but remember the example. If you and I form a compact, and I say, I'll watch your back when you're sleeping, and you watch my back while I'm sleeping, that's what we call a contract. It's a mutual transfer of rights. So for Hobbes, a contract is a mutual transfer of rights. But there's nothing that enforces that contract. I could still slit your throat in your sleep. And so now move on to chapter 15. Well, how do we get out of the state of nature then? How do we avoid that? We need to uphold our contracts. Covenants is the word he uses, kind of covers contracts and any other promises. And why do we need to do this? First of all, reason actually tells us to do this because, again, if it's the original example and I say, hey, you want to form a compact, I'll watch your back and I watch yours, and then I slit your throat, fine, I get some apples, but then what happens? Then I ask, hey, anybody want to form a new compact with me? And of course, nobody's going to take it up. And so the third law of nature is that, and this is really interesting and really important, the third law of nature is that I must uphold my covenants. So that is, and careful, because what is human nature? For Hobbes, self-interest. What Hobbes is saying there is that it is in my own interest. Who cares about anybody else? It is in my long-term interest to uphold covenants. Why? I need Confederates to survive, and I can't have Confederates if I don't uphold my compacts. So, imagine a very primitive society where we have maybe 30 people in a tribe, and I'm the jerk who doesn't uphold my covenants. At best, I get kicked out of said tribe, and now I'm back in the state of nature, which is awful, which is unlivable, which is untenable. And so, again, the third law of nature, that is discoverable by reason and helps me survive, is that I must uphold my covenants. Not out of any sense of honor or duty or justice, but out of self-interest. It is in my self-interest to uphold my covenants. And so here's where the government starts to come in, because you might say, okay, well, why can't we just all, kumbaya and hug each other and uphold our covenants and keep our own promises to each other? The answer is that's just not how humans are. Humans, as a general rule, are, again, the Hobbesian human is going to break their covenants when they think it's in their self-interest. And so what we need is some sort of power, a compelling influence, something that has the power to enforce all contracts, to coerce us to enforce that we fulfill our covenants. And that's the role of Leviathan. So to survive, we have to have Confederates. To have Confederates, we have to uphold covenants. To make sure we uphold covenants, we have to have a government. And first of all, why is it Leviathan? Because to uphold contracts with really big entities requires an even bigger entity. So in contemporary U.S., think of a contract between you and Google, one of the giant companies. Well, if you don't have a government that's kind of protecting you legally, you're just going to get crushed like a bug. And so if who's going to force Google to keep their contracts? Somebody bigger than Google. That's contemporary U.S., but Hobbes probably had things like, the East India Company in mind that were really big and really powerful at the time. It has to be, in order to enforce covenants, it has to be the biggest and the strongest, period. And we need that. We have to have something that enforces covenants in order to, otherwise we fall back into the war of all against all, period. So let's kind of highlight two things, and again, we're going to compare this to Rousseau. I'll say a little more about Rousseau in a bit. So first of all, human nature for Hobbes, always out of self-interest. So in the state of nature, we're basically the equivalent of clever wolves, but fortunately we're clever, which is why we can figure out the laws of nature and therefore get out of the state of nature and survive. Another major thread, notice what the state of nature is like, both in terms of conflict. Well, it's a war of all against all because we all have reasons to kill each other and ability to kill each other. And then but also in terms of important things like rights and right and wrong. So again, there's no justice or injustice in the state of nature. There can't be, says Hobbes, no right or no sin. Why? Because we're just all exercising our right of nature, and there's nothing wrong with that. Um, and of course, the real problem is that everybody has a right to everything. Because how do we get out of the state of nature then? Surrendering most of our rights. By the way, we don't surrender our rights to each other. We surrender our rights to Leviathan. So I will give up my right to your stuff. I don't give that right to you. I give it to the government. So there's this mass transfer of rights. I say mass because there's a little bit of dispute about this. So Dan Garber said that he had a problem with that step. Well, how do we all just kind of simultaneously say, let's get into a government? I don't think we need that, because think of the war of all against all. Uh, Humans are a tiny population, and there's no reason to think that a government has to be constituted by hundreds or thousands of individuals. Rather, how many people does it take to make government? Maybe three? Uh, if three people get together, all right, we all agree that he's in charge, and if you disagree with him, uh, the other two will pile up on you. 2 against 1, we win. And then what? Well, maybe another person joins our little society of 3 people. You could, as long as you surrender your rights to the guy in charge, you could join our society, and so on and so on. So I don't think you need like this giant simultaneous saying yes to government. Rather, it's just this little slow kind of snowballing effect over time. Um, but let's talk lastly about the role of government. So what does government need to do? It has to enforce all its contracts. Uh, Otherwise, it's not a legitimate government. And so if you have a so-called government but it's actually not upholding contracts, that's illegitimate. But remember also, Hobbes says there's certain rights you can't actually give up. So presumably if the government tries to take some of those, say perhaps executing you without trial or something like that, that might be government being illegitimate as well. We don't need to get into it. That's not uh, in this part of the Leviathan reading, but just be aware that there are rights we can't give up, which therefore means those rights don't belong to the government, which means that that government is not legitimate in taking those rights away from you. So those rights cannot be transferred. So in general, the government's job is to keep us out of the state of nature. How does it do that? How does it allow us to pursue peace? By enforcing covenants and being the biggest and the strongest in doing so. That's all. So much for Hobbes. Just looking forward, a couple of things. First of all, if you need discussion board topics, I encourage you to hold off. You'll notice the discussion board is actually comparative. So if you want to write a discussion board about just Hobbes, though, maybe talk a little more about the ramifications of government. Do certain policies say of our government? Do they seem Hobbesian or do they seem contra-Hobbesian, and why? But for the most part, we're going to hold off on those kind of things until we also look at Rousseau. So Rousseau is looking at the exact same topic. And in important ways, he is responding to Hobbes, and he's doing so explicitly. At one point, he notes his important disagreement with Hobbes, and it's going to come from how humans are in the state of nature. That is, what is the natural nature? Redundant. What is the what is the natural state of humans? Are humans clever wolves by nature, or are they something else? And so really pay attention for that. The Rousseau reading is online. The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Pretty good little read. And otherwise, we will see you next time.